William here for Lindsey's English Tutoring, and today I'm going to be analysing this piece on robots that appeared in the 2018 English exam for the Northern Hemisphere. So we should always obviously read the background information before we begin, and what this is telling us is you've got a debate in the news about the capacity of robots and artificial intelligence to impact society. And in this task, you've got two pieces. One piece here by John Jones, a well-known writer on social concerns. And then you have what looks to be a letter to the editor from a resident of Springtown, Ashley O'Hara. So two pieces, and the image here is not a political cartoon or anything of the sort. It's embedded into John Jones's article, so you ought to analyse the image in conjunction with the first article. Consider that Mr. Jones has specifically inserted this image into his article so that it can help to persuade you to agree with his point of view. So you must analyse the picture with the first article. And I've spoken about this in some other videos, but what you really want to do here is to weave the discussion of the image into your discussion of the first article, and take elements of it. So for instance, colour, shape, what it's depicting, mood, stuff like that, and attach that to parts of your analysis where it's relevant. But let's dive in. So in terms of the contention, and I would encourage you, if you haven't yet, to pause the video and have a go at reading through the articles and finding the contention in your opinion, and then unpausing the video, because you'll probably get the most out of this that way. But in my opinion here, the general sort of vibe that this article is exuding is that we need to take a stand against AI, and we need to be concerned about the harms that it can do to our personal lives and our social lives, right? So speaking rather generally then, this is talking about the harms of AI that we might not be so aware of, right, given that we are constantly bombarded with information about robots and how good they are, right? So I always want to try and express the contention in a single sentence, right, that you can put in your intro and then expand on, right? So despite all this stuff about, sharing your private affairs and collecting your data and, jobs being lost and so on and so forth, one way of expressing the contention might be that Jones contends that despite the growing popularity of artificial intelligence, or perhaps despite the rise of artificial intelligence, we should be wary of the harms that it can cause to us, both socially and perhaps in our personal lives as well. So to reiterate, Jones contends that despite the growing popularity of artificial intelligence, we should be wary of the harm that it can cause us in both our social, perhaps in both our personal lives and in society at large, right? So a nice clean sentence like that. And then you can go on to think about the arguments, right? And I've already sort of highlighted them. In my opinion, he starts off by, acknowledging that there are a number of benefits to robots, to perhaps give off more of a balanced perspective, right? Rather than coming across as too biased. You have to consider that he is writing in a national daily newspaper, right? He has to sort of give off the impression that he's not overly biased and perhaps presenting a fairly balanced view, but with his own personal take on it. He is a well-known writer on social concerns, so perhaps that gives him the ability to speak with some authority, right? And as you're reading through the article, that's something to think about. The tone is quite, I suppose, authoritative at times, right? When he makes sort of very morally charged statements, or statements that seem to have a lot of conviction or confidence behind them. Like, one prediction is that this will save billions of dollars and money is powerful, right? So do look out for that as you go through the article. But yeah, he is presenting a bit of a balanced viewpoint in the first paragraph. And then he begins to launch into some of the more substantive arguments about why we should be wary of robots, right? And the first is that, it's an invasion of privacy, essentially. And also, in a similar vein, and you can sort of see this as a connected argument or the same argument, robots also collect our data and perhaps use them, for economic purposes, right? Whether that's to sell our data. In general, that tends to be for advertising purposes, although it's important, obviously, to stick to the article. And here it's prospective employers is one of the examples that's being given. Here you sort of have a literary reference. Big Robot is Watching, referring to a very famous quote from George Orwell's novel 1984. And the original quote is, "Big Brother is watching," and you don't need to necessarily have read the novel or to know it very well, but the novel is about authoritarian governments, right? Governments that have a lot of control over their people and monitor their every move through surveillance, through the collection of data, through agents, so on and so forth. So the author here is trying to evoke that sense of oppression and authoritarianism by making an implicit comparison here between the present world and the world of 1984, both being, futuristic and very surveillance-heavy states, in the opinion of Mr. Jones. Right, so you can probably group all of this into one argument about privacy again. Moving on then to this argument here, this primarily seems to be about humans being made redundant, right? So he gives an example of the Netherlands and how they've displaced lower skilled workers at harbours, for instance. Cleaners becoming, turning into robots at large shopping chains, and then also office workers as well, right? So this argument is really, once again, about the loss of jobs and how robots might displace us. There's a tiny little passage here about values, right? It's quite small, but really it's just highlighting some of the things that robots can't do, such as love, nurture, hug, understand emotion. And I suppose the implicit argument that's being made here is that the burgeoning or the rise of robots is actually contrary to the traditional values that might matter to all of us, which are, love and emotionality and so forth. One does question, I suppose, the cogency or the validity of an argument like this, right? Because, if you have advanced robots who can do all of these, amazing things like clean your house and, solve chess or whatever the case is, may be, right? Just because they can't love or nurture, like how is that necessarily a contravention of our values, right? Is it immoral, in other words, for robots to not be able to love, and so on and so forth? However, a very important thing to note is that even if you disagree with the argument that's being made, even if you think it's faulty in some way, you must not, in your essay, express this. The language analysis task is not for you to present your own opinion on the quality of the arguments, but rather it's for you to present your opinion on how you think the author goes about trying to persuade the audience, right, using written and visual language and using argument. So it's about not so much evaluating the strength or the quality of the argument, but rather the techniques and the process that the author goes through in order to try and persuade you to agree with the contention. And this is something that's highlighted in the examiner's report as well for this exam and for many exams, which is some students feel tempted to comment on the quality of the piece. Ensure that you don't. Especially because sometimes the issues that come up may be rather contentious, relating to, let's say the environment or gender equality or any other such issue that is prevalent in the media at the moment. Resist that temptation to go and analyze the piece in an evaluative way, in other words, in assessing its strength. But there you have it. You sort of have a 2 to 3 argument composition here, and this sort of prelude here, which is really about perhaps presenting a slightly more balanced point of view, right? So let's delve into some of the language, and at the same time we can have a look at the image as well. So it's time for us to take a stand against a growing problem in our society. So notice the inclusive language, trying to suggest that all the readers of his article are a stakeholder and are involved in the current issue, right? This concerns you and you should be worried, right? It is time for us also has a suggestion that perhaps for too long we have remained idle, right? And we've sat with our hands on our bottoms and we've not really thought about the issue or considered it or done too much about it. And so time is expiring, right, as well. So 2 connotations you can draw out there, right? One, we've been, overly complacent up to this point. And 2, there is a sense of growing urgency, which you can then analyze in conjunction with this idea of the problem is the increase, right? Creating this sense of an imminent problem that is going to, get worse if we don't do something about it now. Now, you notice that inclusive language constantly being employed here, and inclusive language has different nuanced purposes depending on the context in which it's deployed, right? So over here, it's trying to get us to all feel that this is an issue which concerns us. But if you think about the inclusive language here, sure, you could take that interpretation as well, right? Our workplaces, our community, our way of life. But one thing that I'll note is that the words that follow after the word our in these sentences are domains, or they're areas of our life that are going to generally be quite dear to us and quite familiar to us, domains of our life that we'll place high value on, right? Our homes, our community, our way of life, and perhaps for some, our workplaces as well, right? All of these are very meaningful to us, and we might even say very valuable to us. So in a very subtle way, Mr. Jones here is perhaps trying to plant a seed in our mind that the rise of artificial intelligence is actually intruding right, into these domains that are dear to us, and also that they're a contravention of our values, right? And we see sort of a reprisal of this idea, or maybe you might call this a bookending of the piece with this idea of values, because at the beginning you've got the invocation of values, and then at the end, once again, you've got the reaffirmation of this idea of values, right? So just because the paragraph here that ostensibly on the surface, right, is this paragraph talking about values is quite small, doesn't necessarily mean that the argument of values isn't important in the piece. It's one that might be expressed in subtler ways, such that it flows throughout the piece, but perhaps slightly beneath the surface. All right. So that's something to think about there. You can always go deeper and really sort of take a few bits of language and think about them deeply, try and come up with some deeper, more creative analysis rather than taking a scattergun approach in general. But we'll keep going. So we're constantly bombarded with information about robots. This is, creating this sense of inundation or being overwhelmed, right? So perhaps evoking a sense of, being overwhelmed, and, I guess also creating another sense that it's all a bit trite or cliche, right? This is constantly happening to us. It, telling us what they can do, right? Making us perhaps feel a sense of scorn for the current situation with the rise of robots, because it's something that we just see day in and day out, and it's the same thing over and over again, and there's lots of it, right? So creating perhaps a sense of scorn or annoyance in the audience. Obviously here you've got the exclusive language, they, right, telling us what they can do, and certainly you can point out the juxtaposition of the inclusive and the exclusive here to intensify, right, that feeling of division, and portray the robots essentially as some sort of alien other to be despised or to be scared of, because they're different. They're not the same as us, right? And it's appealing to a sort of very primal, you might call it xenophobia, that is embedded into the human psyche, right? This idea that if something or someone, sometimes is the case, is different to us in some way, then we should be suspicious of them from the outset, right? And of course, you see that very much in modern media. People play on that xenophobia to try and spur people into various political aims, right? But that's a separate topic. But it is sort of the same human, I guess, aversion towards the other or the difference, right? So what they can do, how versatile they have become, and how many hours they save for their owners. This is the classic rule of three, which is an ancient device where you group arguments or points in groups of three, right, which just tends to be more memorable and persuasive for the audience. The classic example of that being, well, sorry, I shouldn't say the classic. There are many classic examples, right? Like the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? Veni, vidi, vici. There are probably many, many other examples that you can think of, and you can look this up yourselves as well, right? But this is sort of a rhetoric device that you can pick up here. And the repetition of the word how here, right? You can say that helps to sort of reinforce this idea of being bombarded, right? This sense of overwhelming inundation, and also it's sort of becoming a little bit hackneyed, right? A little bit trite and overused and cliche because they're basically just telling us these things over and over again. So it all sort of plays into the same energy. And if you can, in your analysis, draw out these connections between separate words or separate devices and talk about how they all contribute to a single end, and how they sort of harmonize together in your essay, then that's going to really score you some points, because it shows that you understand the piece as a cohesive whole, as a strategy that the author is employing, rather than sort of just picking out a word here, a word there, a device here, maybe a statistic there, right? Try and think about how do some of these devices achieve the same end, despite looking perhaps ostensibly on the surface a little bit different, right? Let's continue on. Again, here you see the repetition of clauses of three. So big businesses use them to clean offices, hotels use them for room service, homes have robotic vacuum cleaners, right? So creating this sense of, I guess, complete invasion, right? No domain is safe, whether it's big business, hotels or homes. Every aspect of our lives is going to contain robots, right? And here he actually seems to express some genuine praise, right? Robots can diagnose some illnesses and perform some surgical procedures. And so again, thinking about the balanced image that he perhaps is trying to portray himself as, and often authors who write perhaps pieces like this that are against technology may be aware that people, readers, are going to have a slightly prejudiced opinion of the author, right? And perhaps think that they're a little bit conservative, right? And we'll have a look at that later in the second article. But, there's a bit of a perception that if you write against robots and the technology in the future, you're sort of an old person who's, been working at the age for like 30 years and, you're just sort of scared of new things, right? But I think the author here is perhaps slightly perceptive of that, right? Aware of that and trying to dispel that up front before he presents the real gist of his argument, right? So the ordering of the arguments or the piece is also something to think about, right? It's much harder once you've given perhaps your the gist of your argument to then sort of backtrack and say, oh, by the way, look, I am a fan of robots in some spheres, right? The cat's already out of the bag. People already have formed a view of you. And, as they say, first impressions matter. So thinking about the order can be important as well in your analysis. Driverless cars are coming closer. It is like a science fiction novel come to life, right? And here's something to think about, because the idea of a science fiction novel may carry some connotations of, exaggerated, hyperbolic, fantastical, and unrealistic, right? So although these novels show us some, really sort of amazing things that might wow us, we accept as readers, as a society, that these things are just written for mere pleasure and enjoyment, and they're not really going to sort of happen perhaps in our lifetimes, right? That's the usually sort of accepted mindset that we might have when we read a science fiction novel. So this may be subtly hinting that what he's about to express, what he has expressed about AI may be too good to be true, right? And this is the perfect moment to, of course, now pivot and to begin presenting the negative side of his argument. Notice how both paragraphs end with a reference to science fiction novel, right? So again, sort of trying to subtly reinforce that through repetition. accentuating the idea, that the state that we live in, this technological state, is like the state of Oceania in 1984 in Big Brother, and Big Brother, I should say. Okay. Of course, we all like the idea of a robot cleaning the house for us while we are at the movies. But what about a robot that is cleverer than we are, right? An algorithm. And here they've got a footnote here explaining what it is. But the fact that they have a footnote here signals to you that this may be sort of a more complex word or a technical word. And so the placement of that here is quite interesting, because I guess it's just accentuating that idea that this is something unknown, right? That we don't really know a lot of, and that sort of gets our defenses up. And we start to think, what is this algorithm, right? And prying into our purchases, our banking details. So traditionally, confidential information here being evoked, and its ability to retain and later share our private affairs, right? I think it's interesting to note the what you might call literary or sound devices here. So prying into our purchases, you've got the alliteration of the P sound, and then later share our private affairs, right? The internal rhyming here of air and air, right? You might say that this is a little bit, it's quite difficult to analyze, but maybe one way you could go about it is to say that it's a little bit hypnotic in a sense. So prying into our purchases, share our private affairs, right? Because it sort of has that hypnotic energy to it, almost a little bit poetic, perhaps there's an expectation that this is just the beginning and there's actually more to this, right? That they might be able to affect our lives detrimentally in other ways. And perhaps also the hypnotism, you might say, is a reference to how technology can hypnotize us, I suppose, and wow us with all of the capabilities that it might ostensibly have, yet at the same time be insidiously putting us into a bit of a spell, right? Such that it can gain control over us. So you do have to be quite creative when you're analyzing these sound devices. But if you can come up with a cogent analysis, then you'll really, really be getting a good score, provided you do everything else correctly. So, this is what you might call anaphora, right? The repetition of words at the beginnings of sentences as sort of a rhetoric persuasive device, right? And there's lots we can talk about, but I'll try not to get overly bogged down here. Rule of three, I'll leave some of this for you to analyze as well, but I'm just trying to show you the process that you might go through when you're looking at this piece, and the underlying themes that flow through it. So digital fingerprints might be worth having a look at, rule of three. Again, purchases and searches, right? That internal rhyming. Analyzed and assumptions, right? The assonance there, repetition of vowel sounds, assonance. And then a literary illusion, which we've talked about, which you could also say is trying to specifically appeal to a more literary audience who have read classic literature, and so trying to sort of appeal to specific subsections of society at different points, given that this is a national daily newspaper. And people who read newspapers these days are probably more likely to read books as well, right? Compared to someone who perhaps gets their news off TV or the radio or social media, right? Considering the medium as well can be sometimes fruitful. But really what's happening here is fear, right? Fear is really the emotion that flows throughout the piece, right? When you see things like the dire consequences they're basically taking over, right? And then your employers could find out what you've been up to, right? What you've been buying, right? Your private affairs. What have you been searching on Google, right? Your employers could find out all of this. What have you been messaging your friends? Yeah, again, fear is a key emotion that you have to identify here. And that is sort of developed when you see things like office workers, don't feel too secure. Metal monsters is probably really the culmination of all of this fear. It's probably the most rhetorical language that he uses throughout the whole piece, calling the robots monsters, right? Imbuing them with this sense of threat and of malice and of danger, and it's sort of a slow build up, and then it sort of creeps up on you, and then he just goes bang, they're monsters, right? And he associates them in terms of values also, robots, with this idea of greed, I suppose. The implicit argument here is that part of the reason robots are rising so quickly in power is because the people who perhaps have interests in these robots, they create the robots, they sell the robots, they run the robots, they rely on the robots. All of these people are doing it for economic gain, right? And so associating robots with avarice, right, with greed, is another sort of clever little value play that he does here. And humans going out of fashion, obviously, really sort of taking an absurd statement here to perhaps create a sense of scorn and disbelief, and perhaps fear as well, right? What would it mean if we went out of fashion? Call to action, right? Here's what you can actually do. Talk to your local MP, presumably, right? That's how you demand legislation, or member of parliament, right? Or perhaps start a petition, etc., etc. Rhetorical question. I'll leave you to ponder that. Looking at the image, note the eyes, for instance. Very sort of, I suppose, suspicious looking, right? And it looks also uncomfortably like a human. Now, I'll leave you to look this up yourself, but if you look up the uncanny on Wikipedia or on Google, you can find some articles which talk about how models or things which resemble very familiar things to us in sometimes quite an eerie way can create a lot of anxiety in us, right? So to put that in another way, perhaps if you build a robot in a way that looks overly like a human, that sort of sends creeps down our spines, or shivers down our spines rather, because it just looks weirdly, vaguely familiar, and it just looks too human, and it freaks us out a little bit, right? It's a bit of a psychological response. And so you can say that the image is evocative of the uncanny, right, in its close resemblance, right, to the human body, with the very human-like features, the hands, the shoulders, the triceps and the biceps, and, the pecs and and the neck, like it's all in human proportions, yet the face just looks weirdly ominous, maybe a little bit dubious, right? Staring into the distance. Think about the color scheme as well. Grayscale, again, emphasizing its inhumanity, and perhaps associating it with a sort of a cold, clinical, technological age, right? These are all things to think about. All right. I am conscious of the time, so I'll try to be concise here. And many of the same arguments will arise here as well. This is a direct counter, right? And we see here conservative, alarmist nonsense, right? It's a derisive tone here, implying that Mr. Jones is just ignorant and biased, and basically just a bit old-fashioned and out of touch, right? And she sort of reinforces that, or he or she, we don't know their gender actually, takes sort of these old-fashioned, what you might call tropes or cliches that most of us today will probably think are just laughable, right? TV giving you square eyes, the ridiculousness of comparing basically the shape of the TV with the shape of eyes, right? To suggest that your eyes will turn into the shape of the thing that you look at. Like, it's such puerile or childish logic. And I'm not saying that, TV won't harm your eyes. It probably will. But really taking this analogy or this trope here where you're using very childish logic reflects then poorly on John Jones, because he or she is Ashley's implying that John Jones thinks like this, right? And notice the length of the sentences here. Short, sharp, staccato sentences that imply that we shouldn't really pay much attention to this BS, right? Pay it short thrift because it's just nonsense. And on the topic of sentence length, do notice the variation here as well in sentence length. So it's like long sentence, short, short, long sentence again, and then short, short. So it's a very common rhetorical device where long sentences are used to convey empirical knowledge or, well sort of thought out arguments that sort of appeal to you intellectually. And then they sort of pepper that with short emotional sentences in order to grab your attention and appeal to what you might call your lizard brain. Competent speech writers or writers in general will often employ this technique, and it's quite subtle. But please do look out for sentence length as well, right? Humans are versatile. We are resilient, appealing to our sense of pride, and also then appealing to history now, saying that, every single time basically that we've been worried of technology, it's actually not been that bad. And most of the time it's helped us, right? That's the gist of the argument. Now, you do have here basically some statistics, right? Some authority which directly counters the argument that John Jones makes, right, about the loss of jobs, by essentially saying that, not only are employers thinking about how to, give redundant employees some new jobs, right, but also new jobs are created by AI, right? You might sort of become a programmer, or you might sort of operate the AI in some way. And in the workplace, robotics is known to increase safety, right? So she's really fighting him on the arena of occupation, of work, right? And saying increases safety, might provide you some new jobs, and most employers are actually trying to keep you employed, right? And then also, here is an appeal to values that's quite subtle. The implication here is that citizens, or humans perhaps, don't deserve to do lowly work. We're not made to do that. We're actually intellectual beings, perhaps, who ought to be given better opportunities, right? So fighting him subtly on the values ground as well. And here you've got that anaphora of no and no, right? But then notice the sentence length. She actually does, or he or she does actually give, a relatively well thought out response in this case to Mr. Jones's arguments, as opposed to here where she just basically makes fun of his arguments. Here she actually responds by saying, in the same sentence, right, by saying, but it can give a parent more quality time with the child. So why do we need a robot to love? That's not the point, she says, or he says, right? It just gives you more time to do what you want and perhaps be more of a human yourself, right? And here's where you can begin to think about perhaps the era, time-wise, temporally, that this piece is written in. This piece is written, and the debate takes place in an epoch where a lot of people feel, I guess, touch starved, emotion starved, relationship starved. People feel like they're worker drones, right? There's a sort of a sense of like, I guess, a bit of a Kafkaesque sense of we're just cogs in the system, right? We go to work at 8 a.m. in the morning, or we've probably got to catch the train so that we can get there by 9, and we finish up at 5, come home at 6, and then you just get on your phone and either order some Uber Eats, or go over to the Coles and then make some dinner, and by the time you're finished and you've washed the dishes up, it's 8 or 9, and you're just knackered, right? So and what time have we got to spend time with our kids, our partners, our parents, our friends, right? What time do we have to engage in these meaningful connections? And perhaps Ashley here is actually aware, or O'Hara, I should say, is aware of the social backdrop that this debate takes place in, and is appealing to that by actually saying this will enable us to be more human. So humanity is the thing that flows throughout this piece. If you can identify that, you'll be gold, right? Humans are versatile. We're resilient. Look at all these things we've done, right? We've survived, we've thrived, and we actually deserve to do meaningful work. And we also deserve to love, right? And to have conversations, right? And to cuddle. And basically, the whole sort of theme, or what you might call the case theory of O'Hara in this piece, is that robots will make us more human, right? Contradicting John's opinion, which is, or his case theory, vis-a-vis humanity, which is robots will perhaps actually diminish humanity or harm humanity by, taking our jobs, spying on us, controlling us, or being tools of control, and one day we're going to go out of fashion. Put it very simply, Jones says robots equals the death of humanity, and O'Hara says robots equals the flourishing of humanity, right? So interesting sort of dichotomy there. All right. So little argument being made here, which is that perhaps sort of implying that if you think that your online purchase history is that interesting to robots, then you're probably a little bit arrogant, in the sense that people don't care as much about your purchase history as you think that they do, or perhaps robots don't, or the people controlling the robots don't, right? Without change, without development, we will become like the dinosaurs, extinct. I guess here, in some sense, sort of alluding to the need to keep up, to stay modern, to survive, evoking maybe a little bit of fear. Although to me, and you've got to be careful, by the way, with how you label these things, right? Because yeah, it's a little bit of fear, but I think if you just wrote fear straight up here, it's the kind of thing where you wouldn't get marked down for it. But a really strong student here is going to note that fear probably needs to be qualified in some way, right? And why do I say that? Well, becoming extinct like the dinosaurs, is that really something that we're overly worried about, right? In the context of robots, right? Maybe in other contexts like global warming, we might be. But in terms of AI, I don't think many of us really have that strong of a fear of that, right? And so it's only a very slight fear. And so I think you can qualify this perhaps by saying that, it's a slight fear, or it's more, although it might sort of evoke a little bit of fear, the main purpose here is perhaps to take history and use that as a lesson, right? So it's got more of a didactic or teaching purpose rather than a scaremongering purpose, even though it may evoke a small amount of fear. If you can sort of tease out the nuance of that, then you'll be doing really well. You don't always just want to take the easy route out and say, it's outrage, it's fear, it's sadness, right? Think about it deeply, and it is something that you'll get better with practice. But I thought I should point that out because it's something that I see quite a bit with, my students over the years. And sometimes it's just because it's what you're trained to do, right? In school, right? You're given a list of tones or devices and you just take a tone from the list and match it to the piece, right? And that's sort of a good way to start off doing language analysis. But once you get used to looking at the devices, the tones, the techniques, and you want to be getting those higher marks and setting yourself apart from other students, then you ought to start thinking about things deeply. And again, my theme for you for today would be quality over quantity, always, right? There is no expectation for you to go through all of this, all of these 2 pages and pick out every little detail. That wouldn't make for a great analysis because 1, you don't have time to do that, and 2, you're going to sacrifice depth. If you have this FOMO, like I have to get everything down, you're not going to be able to come up with creative, deep analyses. And you might sort of pass and get like a B or a B plus or an A or something. But if you want to be really doing well, take some devices, some language, and take it all the way, right? Go deeply. And that doesn't mean that you have to try and squeeze juice out of a stone if the device is truly dry, right? Like sometimes statistics are just statistics. And maybe you can sprinkle 1 or 2 of them in, address them in a sentence or 2, but where you see the opportunity to go deep, you ought to. And so a good piece will sort of have a nice mixture of more sort of shallow surface level analysis, mainly because you can't go much deeper with those devices, like appeal to authority, for instance. But then, some deeper analyses and also drawing out some connections between the devices and how they might harmonize to work together to try and produce the same effect or emotion. So there you have it. I will say I wanted to comment on this writer's theatrical scare tactics. This is actually quite rich. I probably shouldn't ignore this. So this writer, right, not giving Mr. Jones the respect that he deserves, calling him by this sort of, generic label here, this writer. We should disregard what he's saying, belittling him in a sense. And also, writer sometimes has connotations of, trying to create some sort of fictional world, right? Trying to entertain, maybe sometimes trying to advance a particular end, right? Politically or ideologically. No shade against writers. I love writing myself, but, that is perhaps one of the connotations, right, of the writer. They write with a purpose, and that purpose is not, this is the key, it's not always to convey the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, right? It's to frame it in a certain way, even if it is something, allegedly nonfiction, right? Like an autobiography, you still want to frame it in a certain way for your readers. If it's, perhaps a non-fiction book, depending on the field, but often there will be a bit of a bent or a slant to that as well. So do be aware of that. And theatrical and scare tactics, again, sort of painting him out as, a bit of a drama stirrer, trying to sort of mislead you and manipulate you and exploit you, and all probably just for some advertising clicks. Although that's not said, but, that's the general idea. It's just to sort of stir the pot. All right. I hope that all makes sense. You've got 2 articles. Hopefully you feel that you walk away with today with a better understanding of the argument, with the written language and the visual language and how it all works together. And do think about how you might go about incorporating this ultimately onto paper or the screen, as the case may be. But I will leave you with this. I hope you've enjoyed, and I hope you have an excellent day. Take care.